Welcome to Davos, Switzerland. I'm Darshini David and I'm here for the launch of PwC's annual Global CEO Survey. In just 15 minutes we'll be switching live to join PwC's Global Chairman Bob Moritz as he unveils this year's survey results to the world's media. Just ahead of that, as the great and the good gather for this year's World Economic Forum down there in the snowy town of Davos, we'll be looking at the themes of this year's meeting. But first, for this year's survey, we've interviewed almost 1,300 CEOs around the world on their views on the economy and their own company's growth prospects. So what does 2018 hold in store? Let's hear from our very own economist, Barrett Capellion.
So in terms of fast growth, we expect the global economy is going to grow by around 4% in purchasing power parity terms. That's the fastest since 2011, and it basically means that the world will add about $4 to $5 trillion in current value terms to the global economy. The second point is about diversified growth. So growth will not be reliant on a few star performers. It will be much more broad-based. And actually, if you look at the three main engines of the global economy, the US, the Eurozone, as well as China and Japan, Asia, they're going to be growing in a synchronized basis. Actually, these economies in totality make up around 60% of global GDP. There's a couple of economies that we have our eye on. The first one is Colombia. Now, Colombia has been consistently doing better in terms of economic growth rates compared to its neighbors. And one key area of opportunity we see in the medium term in Colombia is the infrastructure sector, to which the government has committed spending quite big sums in the future. So that could spark opportunities both for local businesses as well as international businesses active in the construction space. Now, another mid-sized economy we see a big opportunity in is Vietnam, the so-called gem in the Asian region. Now, Vietnam is currently specialized in high-volume, low-value products, but it is trying to increasingly make the move towards low-volume products, but high-value products.
Barrett Capellion on the global economic outlook for 2018. Now, the theme for this year's meeting is creating a shared future in a fractured world. Emma Benamir from the World Economic Forum explains more.
So really this is a call for collective action. And so creating that shared vision is absolutely essential to help restore the kind of prosperity, peace and harmony in the world that we need today.
And as we move down from the mountains to the town of Davos, let's turn our mind to how we work better together in a fractured world. We asked PwC people around the world for their thoughts. Here are some of their ideas.
I think the way in which people and organizations can work better together in our fractured world is by thinking globally and acting locally. It's even more important today than ever that government organizations, corporates, local communities, and our education system reflect that. The choices that we make, the decisions that we make, and the culture in which we practice them have to have much more in common than they currently do.
I believe organizations and people can better work together by taking time to share with each other stories about their cultures, their backgrounds, and their values. These stories should embrace openness, authenticity, and should be told in a friendly and engaging manner. Sharing these stories can really promote well-being, peace, and inclusiveness for all parties involved.
Being optimistic requires an open mind to find opportunities for success within the brokenness. Open communication facilitates more effective teamwork to get the job done. And trusting one another to solve problems one at a time makes our ultimate goal more achievable. Let's recognize that the task always seems impossible until it's done.
While we all have technology on our minds, the CEOs we spoke to as part of this year's survey had very mixed views about the impact that developments such as robotics, virtual reality or artificial intelligence could have on the customer experience. Here's Jeremy Dalton, our VR expert, with some examples.
I believe virtual and augmented reality are going to have an incredible effect on our lives in the future. Companies are already reaping the benefits by using these technologies to improve the customer experience. Take, for example, the home furnishing industry. furniture companies are using augmented reality to improve the buying experience and take away some of the stress of measuring what will or won't fit in a tight space. Consumers can browse through a collection of pieces, hold up their phone and use the camera to place the digital furniture anywhere in a room, helping them to make informed choices. Another example, the travel business. Travel companies are using virtual reality to offer customers the chance to try before they fly, by donning a VR headset and taking virtual tours of locations and aeroplanes. Whether it's the pyramids in Egypt, the Skyway in Singapore, the parks and skyline of Manhattan, or beach resorts on the Greek islands, consumers can experience what it's like before booking their holiday. The broadcasting industry is another good example. Consumers can watch sporting events live in virtual reality and experience the thrill of the game, straight from their living room. But virtual reality and augmented reality also have some challenges. There have been issues raised around their potential impact on society. What happens if people start to prefer the virtual world to the real world? That's a valid concern. We need to make sure these technologies are used responsibly. But at the same time, virtual reality is already being used to help benefit humanity in all sorts of wonderful ways. For example, in care homes, by offering dementia sufferers the opportunity to experience a past memory in their life. This enables them to engage in a pleasant conversation in the present day. The possibilities are endless, and I'm really excited about the future.
Jeremy Dalton there with his thoughts on virtual reality. Now, every year we ask CEOs around the globe what keeps them awake at night. We spoke to several leaders at PwC about what they think is at the top of the CEO agenda. Here's what they had to say.
With the rise of populism in several countries in our region, CEOs find themselves having to work harder to maintain trust in the business community's ability to foster inclusive development. Our region has been one of the biggest beneficiaries from globalization. Business leaders now have their eyes on the regulatory landscape and its impact on the region's continued ability to grow and to prosper.
Finding and keeping talent with the right skills is a challenge that's on the mind of many CEOs around the world now more than ever. Increasingly, organizations are looking for people with soft skills like creativity, emotional intelligence, and problem solving, but these skills are often the hardest to find. Looking ahead, what will the future of work look like? And how can organizations best prepare for the changes ahead? First, organizations need to understand their current workforce composition, its strengths and its gaps. Then they need to map out what the future holds for them, how their purpose and ways of operating may change over time.
I think it is critical that the digital strategy of firms and their emerging technology agenda is tied into their business models. I think you find many large companies have to think through how to digitize their business that exists today for the world and the way increasingly their customers and their partners and their suppliers are going to be doing business. At the same time, they need to make sure that they have a strategic agenda on new business opportunities that will be coming up and arising every day because of the world changing.
Over the past few years, cybersecurity breaches have grabbed media headlines. One thing's for certain, with the rise of digital networks, no organisation or country is immune. According to the World Economic Forum, cyber attacks, software glitches and other factors could spark systemic failures that cascade across networks and affect societies in unanticipated ways. So what can organisations do to protect themselves from such attacks? PwC's Richard Horn has some thoughts.
The digital age provides immense opportunity for organisations to grow and develop and revolutionise customer experience. However, in seizing these opportunities, organisations can make themselves vulnerable to the very real and increasing number of cybersecurity threats. Managing cyber risk is a fundamental part of business management. The threats are dynamic, broad and sophisticated, and traditional approaches to security are too narrow and flat-footed. The nature of risk has changed, and so the way we manage that risk has to change too. The fact is, we operate in an interconnected world, where a cyber incident in one organisation can affect others, even where there's no direct trading relationship. Traditional approaches to security that focus on compliance and technology in isolation will not give you the confidence to seize opportunities in today's digital connected world. The threat is evolving incredibly rapidly, with nation-states, organised criminals and hacktivists investing huge resources in developing their capability. New skills and capacity are required to understand emerging threats and vulnerabilities, detect incidents when they happen, and respond at pace. Cybersecurity is a strategic issue that has to be understood and led by boards and executive management. It's no longer just a question of execution to be delegated to IT. A successful organisation knows what matters to its success and which risks might undermine that success. Cybersecurity is no different. It's about knowing what digital processes, data and systems matter, what the threats to them are, and how vulnerable they might be.
Richard Horn there talking about cybersecurity. Now, in just a few moments, we'll hear more about CEOs' views on cybersecurity when we switch live to the press conference here in Davos at the hotel just behind me. But before that, let's take a look at how CEO views have changed between 1998 and now.
Hey, Kate. Yeah.
Good evening and a very warm welcome to a very snowy Davos. Thanks for joining us for the live launch of PwC's 21st Global CEO Survey. I'm Darshini David, and I'm here with Bob Moritz, the Global Chairman of PwC, who'll be revealing the details of that survey in just a moment. Bob, a very warm welcome to you this evening. You will, of course, be answering questions from the world's media who are here in the room with us. They've battled through some very bad weather. And we'll also be looking at some of the comments and questions that have been sent in via social media as well. So I'd like to welcome our global audience of viewers who are watching this webcast online. And without any further ado, let's get going because, Bob, we have a lot to talk about this evening.
Absolutely.
We do. And this is the 21st year that PwC has unveiled the survey at the World Economic Forum.
It is the 21st year. It's been interesting because it actually helped set the tone for some of the dialogue that we have at Davos. So this year we had almost 1,300 CEOs participate in the survey. We had representation from about 85 different countries around the world. And we had a mix in terms of segmentation, in terms of size of the organizations as well as the industries that they're interested in. So on behalf of PwC, a warm welcome to everybody, even here in snowy Davos. Good evening to those that are here physically, but good morning, good evening, good afternoon for those that are here virtually. And I would just ask all of us to submit any and all questions that you may have. And we've got members of the PwC Global Leadership Team here
to be able to answer questions that are more specific to countries, regions, or topics as well.
Indeed. So you've got this very comprehensive survey, and we'll have some very comprehensive answers as well. And without any further ado, let's get to the big news here. What are your key findings this year? How are CEOs feeling about the global economy in 2018?
It's interesting. We've asked this question of their confidence around the global economy for about the last 5 years. And we've seen the ups and downs, and you see on the slide here one really interesting data point, which is the confidence level around the global economy over the next 12 months has never been higher in each of the past 5 years that we have, even with all the disruption and concerns that are out there. We'll come back to the reasons why in a moment. The second thing is we had a record increase compared to previous years as well. And we also have the fact that the majority of the CEOs were in the positive side of the equation as opposed to the negative or neutral side of the equation. So it's interesting to see that. Now, one of the underlying themes for everybody to notice is every region around the world was positive as well. And we have not had that for many, many years. In past history, we've had a region. Last year, it was obviously the concerns about Brexit. If you think about 3 years ago, it was the concern about where is China going and the emerging market issues out there. So I think that underlying theme had an impact on the CEO's confidence level around the global economy on an overall basis.
It's an incredible picture. And of course, we're now sitting here full 10 years after the financial crisis as well. So this is quite a significant point. And break it down for us even further, if you will, Bob, but by country, because this is a really interesting picture.
Yeah, so if you look, you've got a tremendous amount of optimism that's showing up on the slide. And I think it's important for us to step back and look at it country by country, because you look at a Brazil, for example, on one side of the extreme, which is tremendously confident when you look at their view on the global economy. Why is that? Relative to what was happening in Brazil over the last 2 or 3 years, going through some of the problems economically, some of the political agenda that was happening, the disruption in terms of the scandals, it clearly gave them a perspective in terms of how confident they were locally on their economy, but also the willingness for others to invest in their economy once some of those things had gone past them. If you look at some of the other economies that are out there, no surprise, China in terms of that being very high on everybody's radar screen, and we'll come back to that point in a moment or two as it compares to being against the US and the like. I think on the other side of the equation, it's also important to look at some of the ones that are on the other extremes. So you see on here the combination of Japan, for example. You see South Africa, for example. Africa, clearly concerned in terms of whether or not the economic growth is benefiting them, which has a morale issue on the CEO's confidence, plus the combination of corruption in the world that they're living in right now. Really dampens the mood in terms of what's happening from a global economic perspective, because that local flavor has an impact not only on what they think, but also how others view Africa as an opportunity. In the case of Japan, as you know, Prime Minister Abe's been pushing very hard on an economic agenda as he looks forward. The big concern there is where are the demographic shifts and the trends trending right now? As you see many of these other countries on the list, you can go to the underlying trends around demographic shifts, rise in economy, rise in population, rise in the middle class and their purchasing power that actually give people confidence as an opportunity to serve clients well or customers well. That gives you an underlying perspective. And last but not least, obviously, is the benefit of the last couple of years with the economic growth that we've had. When you look to a range of 2 to 3, 4%, depending on who you talk to on a worldwide basis, that again has given the CEOs confidence that this trend line is going to continue, even though there might be some clouds out there that everybody's paying attention to.
That's really interesting, isn't it? So, when you put all those factors together, what you're looking at is a picture of increased, might one say, exuberance even about the prospects for the global economy. But of course, you also ask CEOs about how confident they are about their own revenue growth. So just take us through that picture, because it's slightly different.
It is slightly different. So in the past couple of years, we've asked the CEOs, how confident are you in your ability to raise revenues in the next 12 months? Now, you have a positive trend, again this year, but it is clearly not commensurate with the confidence in the global economy. And you have to step back and say, why is that? I think there's 2 or 3 things that come to life when you look at that. First and foremost is there are some concerns out there, and the question are, can they control them? Can they manage through them? And they're more societal in nature in terms of threats that are potentially out there. Second is how good are they in their ability to execute in a very fast-paced world? And we see some winners and losers coming through right now in terms of those that have spent a lot of time getting focused on their company, their execution, being fast, nimble, agile, and resilient. That's where they're able to actually make sure that they can double down in their efforts and take advantage of the many opportunities that are out there right now. And this particular slide shows the countries where their confidence actually is showing at a high level or at a lower level. And this is where it's really important to see, no surprise, you see the combination of the Americas between Canada and the US, the combination of their confidence in the global economy, plus their ability to execute, comes through time and time again, and that goes, I think, to the quality of the management that's in those organizations and the focus to take advantage of the opportunities. The other one that's of interest that we don't talk a lot about on a worldwide basis is India. India's confidence continues to increase on a significant basis on a worldwide level, not only for the Indian CEOs, but as CEOs around the world look to India as an opportunity for them. And obviously with Prime Minister Modi here, he's going to have a lot to say about that over the next couple of days.
Of course, it'll be interesting to hear all that. So that kind of explains why we're seeing that sort of shift between, you know, people in the corner office feeling optimistic about their own prospects for their revenue, but perhaps more bullish about the global economy. Pull this all together for us, Bob, because clearly one of the things that really matters when you look at the global picture is how this feeds through into jobs growth and hiring plans. How does it?
Yeah, so when you look at the question of are you going to increase hiring, decrease hiring, or stay neutral, you actually see a slight increase in the organizations that will continue to increase hiring at a higher level than they had in previous years. Again, it's probably more commensurate with the increase of their confidence of their ability to deliver revenues over the next 12 months. Now, what's interesting in this slide, I think, is two factors. One is the confidence to go higher, but underneath it is, even with this concern about job creation, job security, and the impact on technology, the CEOs are still looking to increase headcount because we would say, and there's some research PwC has put out there recently, the impact on artificial intelligence, digital, robotics, and the like is going to have a big impact on companies before it does on employment. And that's a timing issue in terms of how soon it'll actually impact the job creation or the job security right now. So it's something very important for us to think about. The second thing that's in here underneath the report is the fact when you look at where the confidence is coming from a headcount perspective, healthcare, technology, and the services industries are the three that have the biggest increase as you look at the opportunity in terms of increasing headcount on a sector-by-sector basis. On the other side of the equation, you've got the banking industry, the insurance industry, forestry, retail, consumer. That's probably going to be more impacted on the negative side, and that's where you are starting to see activities actually being impacted by disruption from technology that's having an impact on their ability to employ people on a going forward basis.
Interesting. So the service sector is by no means homogenous by any means, but we'll come back to the point about artificial intelligence a little bit later on. But I just want to go into a bit more detail about what you ask CEOs about where they see the sources of growth. Where is it coming from over the next year or so?
Yeah, so actually, as you look, this is a story that for the most part is consistent with the last 2 to 3 years. And what I mean by that is you see the top 5 countries basically being US, China, here Germany, UK, India, with the major change this year, at least in the top 5, with actually India rising up into the top 5, which ties back to my earlier comments as you look before, and that jumps ahead of Japan in terms of the opportunities that are sitting there. So I think it's interesting to see that, but I would also say that the CEOs, when we ask them, see many more opportunities. 5 years ago, they probably would have had a small list of countries they think they want to invest in. Because of the world being so much smaller with social media, connectivity, and the like, even though we talk about these concepts of populism and nationalism and maybe anti-globalism, they are seeing opportunities and then placing bets in lots of different places. So the laundry list of where to invest is actually increasing and is very country by country specific and or sector specific. The second thing that's important here is the difference in the game of being number 1 or number 2 with the US and China.
Yes.
So the U.S. continues to enhance its lead over China, albeit many organizations around the world are focused on both countries as big opportunities, I think for vastly different reasons in terms of what's happening there. And that's why I think when you look at these 2 countries, you're going to continue to see them top of the list, but really for 2 fundamentally different reasons as you look ahead.
Now, lots of visitors, of course, coming to Davos over the course of the week. One in particular might be quite pleased to see the U.S. is holding on to top position there. Any sign of a Trump effect? What lies behind this?
So first, I think we have to dissect each country. In the case of China, the underlying trends continue to be tremendously impactful in terms of demographic shifts and billions of people actually in that country and the needs that they have in terms of consumption. So everybody around the world is seeing that as a big opportunity for them to do something. On the other side of the equation, we still have issues around the ability for them to have ease to the marketplace, rule of law, the corruption concerns that are out there, as well as the ease of doing business. And I think it's known, and actually recently, as you saw the next administration come through, they pointed at that issue of figuring out ways to make that easier. So I think the president there clearly has this top of mind as he looks ahead. In the case of the U.S., there is no surprise here. You've got a great consumer base. You've got a tremendous amount of innovation happening in the country. You do have rule of law, so everybody knows how to play the game, so to speak, in terms of the way to do business. And the current administration is trying to figure out ways to make it easier to do business as they take regulation down. And obviously the tax reform, which is beneficial to those companies as well as beneficial to companies around the world. And I do think, just to remind people, this survey was, in fact, done before the tax reform actually came in.
Yes.
Albeit, I would say, anecdotally, the CEOs we interviewed around the world did expect something to happen on an anecdotal
along those sort of lines. But it is fascinating, isn't it, when you see that duel between China and the US for pole position. And I'll be interested to see how it goes in next year's survey. But we've been very upbeat and optimistic so far, Bob. I think we need to look at some of the more cautious feelings that have come in through here. What is keeping CEOs around the globe awake at night? What do they see as the threats out there?
So it's interesting this year, and you'll see it in the slide in a moment. The number one threat continues to be, from a business perspective, the CEO's perspective, the concern about overregulation. Now, deeper into that, actually, it's no longer the number one risk coming out of the U.S., which it used to be, and actually the U.S. used to drive that number up when you look at the demographics. And in fact, that's dropped down, no surprise against, with a little bit of focus on the administration in terms of what it's trying to do. The second major theme, though, that's coming through that you see this year is a lot more societal threats.
Right.
So the issues around, for example, climate change, which rose dramatically. I'll come back to that in a second.
Yeah.
With the issues around refugees, the issues around geopolitics, the concerns about terrorism, things that CEOs can't control have risen to a fairly high level pretty quickly on the risk of threats, which causes then CEOs to think about scenario plans for those, as opposed to real actions that they can take. So to be prepared for those if, in fact, they happen. And you see the traditional business risks around FX, ability to refinance, et cetera, dropping down a lot. Now, just touch on two other threats here more specifically. In the case of climate change, which did rise dramatically.
Were you surprised by that?
I don't think I was surprised. I don't think it would surprise anybody when you look at two factors here. One is it continues to be a concern when you look at what's happening on a worldwide basis with some of the issues around some of the storms and the disruptive nature that's happened. What also is interesting in the details of the data, the U.S. CEOs have not significantly increased that as a threat to them. There is a slight bump, but not very big. But because of the U.S. position here, it obviously has risen the concern on everybody else around the world. And that number did dramatically increase as they're worried about the U.S. and its position on the Paris Accord and the like. And obviously the other big one, which everybody is focused about on, is in fact cyber right now.
It is, absolutely. Can we sort of zero in on that a little bit and have a look at the detail there? Because, of course, things do vary according to where in the world you are. So how do we pinpoint exactly where the threat seems to be the greatest?
So in cyber, I think you've got a number of countries that is really driving this uptick in a significant basis. No surprise, US and UK. And I think in that case, you've got awareness because of some of the activity that happened over the last year. You've got a consumer base that's very interested in this now in terms of the companies and the organizations that are focused on it. And you've got governments that are paying particular attention to it. The reason this has spiked so high is the continuation of the threat continues to increase, but the preparedness is not rising at the same level of concern of the threat itself. So there's a bigger gap as opposed to us closing the gap. And other studies that PwC has done has demonstrated that in terms of how organizations are prepared both at a management level, a governance level. We also see data points where showing that countries are not as prepared in terms of how quickly they can respond to incidents that are out there. So it's no surprise that this is becoming a more important issue. And when you look at technology and digital and the use of more data, I would tell you that is going to increase the risk of cyber as we become more connected. It also is a big opportunity to use technology to defend against a cyber attack for the organizations that get that and do something about it and leverage the assets they have in forms of artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, and the like to actually combat the threat that's out there.
Absolutely. I mean, at least they're showing more awareness of the issues out there, which is encouraging. Let's go back to that issue of emerging technologies and what CEOs had to say about that, because there's some interesting findings here.
There is. everyone has got an interest in the implications of technology broadly. And you'll see in the report, we asked a couple of very specific questions. This one is pretty interesting. The question specifically of the CEOs was, how do you see the impact on artificial intelligence and robotics on the enhancement of customer experience? And we got a muddled picture from the CEO community in terms of, do they see an impact? Are they understanding what that possibility is? And you see here a relatively small amount of CEOs that are really focused on this. And we think at PwC that's actually a missed opportunity. When you look at the combination of all different types of technologies, and this goes to not only AI and robotics, but also to machine learning, disruption around D&I in terms of data analytics, drone technology, blockchain, and the like, there's some huge opportunities to not only identify customer needs, but react to customer needs in a big-time way. But it means that the CEOs, their management teams have got to be much more focused on the opportunity here rather than just the threat, for example, in the area of cyber.
We've talked about senior figures in companies around the globe, but let's focus on you for a minute, Bob, because when we talk about AI, what's your own perspective? How can you see it revolutionizing PwC's ways of working?
So PwC continues to be dominant in the audit, tax, consulting, deal space, et cetera. And we are not immune to this issue either. I would say we are taking a more holistic approach of looking at multiple aspects of technologies, and we use the WEF's definition of what that fourth industrial revolution looks like when you think about different types, not just robotics and artificial intelligence. Each one of our businesses will be impacted. And that goes to how do we continue to provide more value, more effectively and efficient, because everybody wants more for less. They want to see us use technology, and they want us to help them use technology themselves. Second, is that we are using technology today to rethink the work, how we do it, how do we automate it, and how, in fact, we'll have a better beneficial interest, not only to the customers, but also to our own people. And we're looking at all stakeholders when we think about the implication of technology, not just necessarily the clients, or not necessarily just around quality as it relates to, for example, our audit business. But there's big opportunity in there as well across all of our business units. And last but not least is we do believe that the system will change. How, in fact, audits are done in the future. What's the role of taxation departments around the world? How, in fact, organizations buy and consume services from a consulting perspective. The entire market's going to shift because technology is enabling that to be delivered in a much different way. And that's where we're experimenting, we're deploying, and we're leveraging technology in a big-time way. It's probably one of our biggest investments inside PwC today.
You can imagine there are going to be lots of conversations on that particular topic over the course of this week. What, 2,000 people gathered here for Davos this week? And, of course, the theme is creating a shared future in a fractured world, and that's something CEOs have been talking to you in the survey about. I mean, how do they perceive this fractured world? What, if anything, do they think can be done? What's going to happen?
Yeah, it's interesting. We show within the report, if you've had a chance to look at it, a number of very specific questions that actually go to the benefit of globalization, or perhaps did globalization serve the masses as much as we would hope it would. In one case, we actually get tremendous positives in terms of the implications of globalization that has helped people connect with one another in a big-time way. And that's actually shrunk the world and the ability to capture opportunities. And you see that tremendously when you look at, for example, what's coming out of Asia-Pacific with the demographic shifts that are there. But on the other side of the equation, and this question up on the slide points to it, does the opportunity that's in front of us actually serve the many or the few? And we do have a fractured or a polarized world in terms of the 1,300 CEOs, and we're almost equally split in terms of how they view the fact that these concepts of economic growth and opportunity will impact many versus fewer. And are we as, I'll call it inclusive, as we need to do as a business community in terms of the benefits of that growth and how, in fact, it should hopefully help people to make sure that we don't have the divisiveness in society. The good news here is I think the CEOs see that as a major issue, regardless of which side of the fence you're on. I think they're committed to actually take the actions. One very interesting data point here is knowing that there's concerns on a worldwide basis around job security coming from technology or the job opportunities because of robotics and the like. They are committed and are already evidencing how they are retraining their own people to be more fit for purpose going forward. And that, to me, demonstrates that the CEO community is trying to help in making sure this is a much more inclusive opportunity for them, the countries that they're in and the people within those countries, so they actually see the benefit as well to offset what's on the right-hand side of this page.
That's an interesting split, isn't it? We're going to open up the floor to questions. There's a microphone that'll be arranged there. Just before we come to the floor, though, we're getting loads of questions in online, Bob. I mean, they're coming in from all over the globe. I'm going to start off with one of those because the question is, you know, these have been fascinating findings, but what was the biggest surprise for you when you looked at these results when they came in?
So two things I think hit me. One was the fact that the confidence was as high as it was. When you look at some of the existential threats that are out there. And this is now a short-term horizon versus a longer-term horizon. So one data point I did not speak of is not only their confidence to deliver over the next 12 months, but in fact their confidence over the next 3 years.
Yes.
Now what's interesting, in the past when we looked at this, every year it continued to get better. This is the first year in a long time it actually came down over a 3-year period, which tells you that the CEOs absolutely think they can perhaps deliver over the short term. But wow, these things that are in the horizon, these clouds that we just talked about, do have an impact and a questionable aspect in terms of the confidence that it has in their economy. The second thing that came through is this concern around technology. We already pointed to one of them. And this is where we are seeing big opportunities for those that get and actually do something with technology as an asset rather than fear it in terms of a liability. And those are the two things I think we'll hear a lot about this week in Davos as well.
I'm absolutely sure. There were some questions here. I just want to mention as well, the microphone lady here towards the front, please.
Hi, Alicia Gonzalez from El País. I've read in the report that the last time the optimism of the US leaders were so high, it was in 2007. I mean, the year before the financial crisis exploded. Does it mean that we are foreseeing an explosion, a bubble, or something ahead of us? Thank you.
So I'll give a quick comment, and I'll ask our U.S. leader, Tim Ryan, to talk about this as well. It is tied back to the fact that the rise in the optimism in the U.S. specifically does go back to 2007. But I also think there's a lot of lessons learned that people have applied in the last 10 years or so. But Tim, why don't you take a crack at the question in terms of how the U.S. economy and the business community is thinking about this issue?
So we're certainly definitely not planning on a financial crisis, first of all. But what I would tell you is we think the optimism does go to the strength of the economy. The optimism goes to the fact that many CEOs have learned from the financial crisis. And over the last 10 years, we've seen a tremendous increase in the skill set in the CEO suite. We've seen better understanding of the need to maintain liquidity, improve balance sheets, build skill sets, do scenario planning, and also make sure they're looking at a broader group of stakeholders. So we think the confidence level increase is there for different reasons. And also we look forward, going to the threats that Bob talked about, a better understanding of how to manage those threats going forward.
Thank you. I should mention we have leaders, senior leaders from every region of the globe here from PwC. So if you've got a question about a region, they're perfectly equipped to answer that. We're going to take one question from online and we'll come back to the floor in just a second. And Bob, this is, I think, one for you. This is saying, what's the most significant trend that you've noticed when you review the current CEO results against the previous year's results?
So it is that optimism that came through, tremendously different than previous years. And I think it's as well the shift in the risks and the threats that the CEOs are focused on. The thing I would tell you is we interact with CEOs, their management teams, and their boards. You saw last year and the previous year a focus on the CEO's ability to manage many stakeholders and perhaps the combative nature of those expectations of those stakeholders.
Interesting.
And when you think about how do you apply that now of an increasing list of threats that are both controllable from their own business perspective or maybe not controllable, it puts an interesting dynamic in terms of the ability of the CEO, the board, and the management team to be able to manage all of this and the degree of difficulty. And that's why we went to the theme that we did in terms of the cautious optimist in the corner office, because there's a lot on their agenda, including how do they work with governments to deal with some of the issues that are ongoing. And that, I think, is an increasing trend that has continued to rise year over year, and we particularly saw it from last year to this year.
Yeah, it's interesting you've used the phrase cautious optimism, so clearly the lessons learned from 2007 seem to be still there in people's minds.
Yeah.
Fantastic. There was a question, a lady at the back had her hand up for a while, so, and I'll come back a little bit further forward. Thank you.
Hi, this is Shireen from CNBC India. India is now in the top 5. I just wanted to understand what were the specific reasons that CEOs gave for this improvement in ranking.
Great. So Shamal, who is our senior partner out of India, is here with us. So maybe Shamal, if I can ask you to stand up and provide a little bit of perspective on the CEOs coming out of India as well as India overall.
I think that I think the basic thing that's coming out is the confidence in the economy. I think when the economy which is driven by consumption, and the CEOs look at it that if an economy is going from 6.5% to 7% in the near term, and then that was number one on their list. The second one that clearly was the government effort to have what they call is ease of doing business. And the World Bank report this time, which actually said India moved from 30 points from 130 to 100%. So that was the second one, which clearly. And the third one is government's ability to make big reforms, particularly on the goods and services tax reform that's been rolled out earlier. So clearly those are the three ones that you can see the CEOs are very, very confident about the future growth, near term and long term.
I think in the case of India, you've had many CEOs believe that there's huge opportunity. And the question is it realizable? And it goes back to this ease of being able to do business and some of the things that Prime Minister Modi has put on the table in terms of the reforms. And I do think that you've got a CEO community that's watching that very carefully and waiting for it to cascade down into the prefectures and the states and the like. And I think if I were to predict over the next couple of years, you're going to continue to see India rise in terms of the opportunities, perhaps even more so against the developed countries that are in that normal list that we see in terms of what's happening on a worldwide basis of where people are willing to invest.
Yeah, talking about the developed world, the questions just come through online about German confidence. Has that been impacted by the lack of a government in Germany? It's a good question.
So no leadership and therefore positive results, is that the message?
Absolutely.
So Norbert Winkel-Johann is here, who represents us out of Germany as well as PwC Europe. So Norbert, why don't you give some perspective on that?
Yeah, of course. So from my perspective, you are right, Bob. On the global expectations, there is no influence of having a German government or not. So I would say from the survey results, the German CEOs are more bullish according to the global economy. It's more the opposite if we ask German CEOs about their own growth. And then we realize, okay, there is obviously an impact. And when we did the survey, that was just after the German election. So there was a high level of uncertainty, which kind of coalition we can manage, how the government will be, and what kind of reforms we can expect. And that was, I think, the reason that they were very confident, very conservative regarding the German results.
Yep. Good.
Fantastic. Nick there in the middle. Thank you.
Nick Gowing, running a project called Thinking the Unthinkable. And Bob, I'd like to put to you that you just said the existential threats surprised you that so many were so confident. Can I put it to you, not least based on our own data, there are a lot of leaders who are actually convincing themselves that things are much better than they really are, and that the existential threats aren't really going to happen. And I was very struck by your AI data, particularly, as if they fully understand what's coming down the track, when many claim they don't.
Yeah, I think when you look at the CEOs right now, two things happen particularly around AI. One is, do they have a sufficient understanding of the implications, not only to the work that happens in their organizations, but candidly the disruption to the sectors that they're in and the like. And I do think there's a pretty positive degree of resiliency that's in the mindset that we manage this over the short term. It's interesting, I think anytime the leadership team here at PwC interacts, what's the dividing line? When are we going to hit that inflection point where there's a really disruptive implication associated with that? And you have different points of view. Some believe it's in the next 2 to 3 years, and therefore there's a higher sense of urgency to deal with it right away and be much more prepared for it. Others thinks it's in that 5 to 10 year type of range. So the advice we're giving CEOs from our own perspective, and we're applying it to ourselves, to your question is, do you have enough knowledge of what's going on in the world? Do you have people on your leadership team that understand the implications and how it really does have an impact on not only your business today, but the ecosystem that you're part of? And last but not least, are you pushing hard enough to realize the value and the benefits from the technology investments that you're getting today and the value and benefits of the technology disruption that could come tomorrow? And the organizations that do that well, I think, are going to end up being the winners over the next decade or two as we sit here today.
Thank you. Another one coming in online. UK confidence. Would it have been higher had you posed the questions after the Brexit deal? I'm guessing they mean the initial joint.
Yeah, so obviously you saw the data coming out of the UK. I've got Kevin Ellis here, who leads our UK, but also the region across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So Kevin, do you want to talk a little bit about the UK confidence level as well as the follow-on based upon the Brexit discussions that have been ongoing?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Yeah, the UK was more confident, certainly looking out at the global economy compared to previous years, and was more confident of the UK CEOs for their own businesses. But when looking on a relative basis against other territories, other developing countries, it wasn't as strong. And I think that does reflect the fact that this survey was done prior to the breakthrough in the negotiations in December. But in general, I think it's hard to speculate on that totally. There is still a certain lack of confidence in the UK as you go through the whole Brexit negotiations.
Yep. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you. Interesting one to watch, that one. Another question from the floor. There's one here, please. Everyone seems very quiet on that side of the audience.
Hey, Bob. Ray One with Constellation Research. Given the repatriation that's going to happen with the U.S. tax plan, about $300 billion to about $400 billion, do you see an acceleration in mergers and acquisitions that's going to happen in the next year based on that? I didn't see it in the data, but maybe it's an offset.
So maybe I'll ask Tim to comment in terms of what we're seeing in the U.S., and then I'll circle back to what we're seeing more globally as well.
Yeah, so very important question. When we look at the confidence U.S. CEOs have in their ability to grow, it is very high. When we drilled down in the survey, what we saw is CEOs expect to get growth from two key areas. Number one, over 90% of CEOs expect to have organic growth in the United States, but 69% also expect to have growth by M&A. So short answer is we do expect to see higher volume M&A driven by tax reform, but also the need to find synergies, going back to the technology discussion that you just had as well, because M&A and trying to partner with technology is a big aspect of it as well.
Further to Tim's point, if you were to ask the question the way we did, which is in the survey, how will you capture that growth? You see the M&A statistics, so it actually remains pretty consistent year over year, and I think the more recent data that Tim talked about probably talks to the uptick that's likely to happen. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that you're getting a lot of M&A on a worldwide basis as you think about collection of IP and availability of resources. Those two things, I think, do drive perhaps a different perspective of M&A in terms of just going after market share and new product development in terms of the opportunities. And that could be either M&A or maybe joint venture and alliances, which continues to be an opportunity, I think, for organizations to transform themselves as they look ahead. Great.
Thank you. Bob, just to look at the jobs picture slightly more closely here. We've got a question that's come in online, which is about what type of jobs. You know, we've got very positive thinking CEOs at the moment when it comes to hiring plans. What sort of jobs are they talking about? I mean, are we talking about zero-hour contracts? Are we talking about skilled jobs? I suppose there's two ways of looking at this, the year ahead and also, of course, more further ahead, given what you're saying about AI.
Absolutely. So let me ask Olga, who is our leader in Central and Eastern Europe, to comment a little bit on the skill sets that people are looking for going forward and the manner by which they're trying to find them right now. So Olga, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so last year we actually saw quite a lot of anxiety about technology displacing jobs. But what we're seeing this year is CEOs, business leaders being quite confident. And in fact, over 80% of business leaders worldwide said that they either want to increase or maintain the employment levels. And what we're seeing in practice, talking to the CEOs, that actually as they're looking to embed technology and transform the businesses, they're finding that they're needing more people and people with better skills. So yes, they're looking for technology skills, for digital skills, but they're also looking for problem solving, for leadership, for adaptability, creativity, and for those kind of more emotional intelligence skills that will help them transform the businesses and will help them understand the customers a lot more. So in fact, the flip side of that trend we're seeing is that actually CEOs are worried about availability of skills, and many of them see it as one of the threats. How will they attract, motivate, and retain top talent?
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
The other one more piece on this, I think, which is really important, is as you look at the workforce of the future and some of the research that we've done on a worldwide basis, you then tap onto that two phenomenons. One is the fact that everybody's looking for these digital skills. There's not enough out there, particularly for certain industries. And therefore, what are organizations and industries doing to reinvest in the education of their own workforce to transfer those skills? And that's why I do think the CEOs have done so and will continue to do so even more forward, which helps, I think, with some of the societal issues that we talk about in terms of divisiveness and inclusiveness that's out there.
Indeed, because tomorrow's leaders could look very different.
Absolutely. And then the second piece here is the phenomenon of more part-time workers, which I think has a whole level of downstream effects in terms of funding of pension obligations, retirement plans, and things of that nature, and the ability to actually tap into resources on a variable basis, not on a permanent basis, which goes back to how people are managing workforce with regard to productivity. And we do see that phenomenon happening quite a bit as we look ahead as well.
Fascinating. Questions from the floor. Gentlemen over here. Finally, we have a question from this side of the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Jorge Valero with the Spanish Daily El Economista. A quick question related to the threats, in concrete the tech threats. Would you recommend to invest in blockchain, and have you invested in in Bitcoin, and have you invested in Bitcoin?
So we have advised many Bitcoin companies in terms of how they actually have to think about their own business plans and perhaps what they need to do to justify it and gain the trust that's going to be needed as you look forward ahead. We have piloted some investments in those kind of companies, and I would argue that PwC, no different than the other organizations, have to understand the implications of these new technologies and new implications, and to take a little bit of a portfolio approach in terms of putting some insight, some capital against it, but on a reasonable basis. And you do not want to be betting the farm when you look at the divisiveness that comes from some of the Bitcoin currency conversations, particularly at some of the banking authorities and the banking CEOs in terms of different points of views that are coming from it right now. But I do think it's a reality when you look at the fundamental aspects of blockchain that I do see as an opportunity. So I do think people have got to be more in the game and playing with it a little bit more so than avoiding it in its entirety. And I think that's where if you do it on a very limited basis, you learn, you adjust, and you manage your risk correctly, I think there's an opportunity to think about what you want to do and how far do you want to go with both blockchain on a more broader scale basis as well as Bitcoin overall.
And I guess that's something that's going to be discussed lots. I can't believe you've made it through this far without mentioning Bitcoin, but we've got it in there now. So there it is. Let's go back to something you were mentioning a little while ago. So we've had another question in about societal threats in the future, and this one specifically asking about what kind of qualities do CEOs need to possess now, I guess, but also going forward.
This goes back to what Olga talked about, I think, for more broadly around organizations and the talent that they need. I think you need CEOs that can understand how to deal with the many trade-offs that are needed. So having an ability to be authentic and engage with a wider group of stakeholders, be able to articulate a vision of how do you actually manage and deal with all those different stakeholders, and create an inspiration and confidence level that, in fact, the world's full of opportunities of which we can capture on if we execute well. Mm-hmm. And then he or she surround themselves with the right leadership team with the right skills. And this goes back to the point in terms of make sure you've got some emerging technologists and disruptors on your team so you understand that world that's going forward. We recently put out a thought leadership piece in terms of the role of the CEO and 6 different elements that actually straddle how do you end up being humble in the eyes of your stakeholders, but confident enough to actually execute through these areas of uncertainty?
It's quite a balance.
How do you balance the issue of being focused on productivity and execution and the bottom line, but still actually retaining the soft aspect of how do you serve society? So the straggling of these aspects become really important from a CEO's perspective. Last point I will make in this case, the CEO can't do it by themselves. And the reality is you actually want to make sure that CEO is great at actually identifying talent, leveraging talent, and that talent comes from his or her management team as much as it goes to how they actually have the board around them to the extent that board can create advice and they listen carefully to that advice and all the experience that comes through it.
Good point. And I think there's another question here towards the front. Gentleman here, please.
Thank you. Frank Kane from Arab News, a Saudi newspaper. The maps that you put up there in the beginning, there seems to be a big hole between India and South Africa. Mm-hmm. But that's quite a big region, that. It's the Middle East where I live, it's North Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Do you do any business there? Have you any view on what's happening there?
So I think...
Is there somebody over there who's an expert?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll have Kevin Ellis, our leader from a Europe, Middle East, and Africa perspective, comment in a second. But we do business in that part of the world. We do see opportunities, particularly in the Middle East, and we didn't talk a lot about the Middle East today as you look at that, but I do think it's interesting in terms of some of the geopolitical dynamics that are happening there country to country and some of the implications of that. You do see opportunities as you think about where some of the individual countries are actually trying to diversify, and we see that clearly in Saudi right now, but also Iran as you look ahead in terms of what may or may not happen coming out of the U.S. sanctions, but clearly around the rest of the world, you're seeing people actually jump into this game. But I'll ask Kevin to talk a little bit about how, in fact, the confidence level of the CEOs are looking at the opportunities in the Middle East, because it's a little bit more tailored to the sector than it is on a broader scale basis. Kevin?
Yeah, we're seeing an increase in interest in the Middle East. From our point of view, professional service in the Middle East, one of the fastest growing areas of all of our practices right across Europe. So we're seeing huge growth there. And that is driven by the fact that the opportunity there across quite a large expanse, but also in terms of just general interest in wealth creation, the sovereign wealth funds there as well.
Thank you. Lots of questions coming in, Bob, all the time. This one's interesting because it's picked up on the point that we saw on one of your slides there, that half the CEOs questioned seem unclear on the impact of AI. The questioner says, surely they need to get up to speed.
So I'll ask Stephanie Hyde to maybe tackle this question. Stephanie runs our markets function, which is the sectors, as well as our large accounts and our small accounts, all through the different segmentation, to give a perspective of what we're talking to CEOs about around the world, regardless of the size or the sector of the organizations we're dealing with.
Thanks, Bob. So, yes, you talked about how there was an unclear picture there, but actually when you look at artificial intelligence, 2/3 of companies questioned did say, the CEO said that they found that it was going to be disruptive. But half of them, only half, were clear on what was going to happen with their customer experience. Interestingly, this had a real big difference amongst the countries. So Spain and China were much more clear on how AI would impact their customer experience than the other countries. So there is definitely a mixed picture, and it's clear that they do need to spend more time on that. And in the conversations we're having with companies, they are spending a lot of time looking at this. So more to come, I think.
I think the interesting thing when you look at AI that all of us have to pay attention to, and this will come through, I think, in the future years, is what China has done in this area when government and business have worked together in the space. For those that have been in China and really have spent a lot of time there working with either the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the small startups, and or the larger organizations, there is a tremendous amount of momentum right now that's building in leveraging AI for capital improvements, societal improvements, and business improvements. And I think you're going to start to see that quite a bit, which I also think is going to put other countries more aggressively on the curve to say, we've got to do much more here so we don't lose competitive advantage of what's happening. And again, you've got to spend some time in the weeds in China to see it up close and personal, to understand how much momentum has actually built up over the last 2 to 3 years right now.
Absolutely. But the clock is almost against us here, but I've got to ask you this question. It's come through online, and you are a veteran of the World Economic Forum. Now, what should Donald Trump do at Davos to keep the crowd happy? What are your top tips?
Normally, I would ask my U.S. representative to do this one, but I'm not going to do that and put him on the spot. I'm not sure the goal of anybody here should be to keep everybody happy. The idea of Davos is very much to put some provocative points of view on the table where you actually can get much more awareness on issues and bring perspectives that create a different level of thinking and the appropriate dialogue to actually take a different action to get a much better result. And if anybody, even Prime Minister Modi tomorrow, who will open up the session, if he's going to try to come in here trying to make everybody happy, we've missed the opportunity in Davos to go there. So you notice, being a veteran here in Davos, I didn't answer your question specifically, but I do think it's important for us to actually make sure that the world understands different points of view, different perspectives, not only what they are, but why do they fundamentally believe that, so we can have a better dialogue to actually then understand what each does, wants to do, and should do as we think about the world that we're living in. And this theme of fractured world is evident when you travel around the world, or you ask CEOs, or you ask stakeholders or governments. And the best thing that we can do with this group over the next few days, never mind trying to trudge our way through the snow, is actually get in a much more provocative conversation that hopefully at the end comes up with better action that gets to better results.
I'm sure there'll be plenty of provocative things ahead. You answered that one very constructively, yet tactfully. I mean, as a veteran of Davos would do. We're almost out of time, but your key takeaways from the survey, how would you sum it up? It struck me as being very surprising in many ways.
So the thing I would say is you look at the role of business and the role of CEOs in society. I think we have to actually step back and say, how can the business community do much more to help with some of the agenda and the distance that's been traveled, particularly over the last 12 months, as you look at the concepts of globalization versus populism and nationalism. First and foremost, I think the business community should spend some time thinking about, with others, what are the right measures to determine success? We have spent the last number of decades focused on financial outputs that arguably have left some behind. And I do think there should be a combination of financial outputs and, more importantly, contributions to a more inclusive society to measure success in a different way. And I do think the CEOs are starting to understand that and asking for help, and we see some organizations actually doing that. The second thing is that you have to make sure that you take advantage of technology. There is a clear momentum that is built. We've seen it over the last 3, 4, 5 years here in Davos. And I think the curve is going to tremendously uptick in a big-time way. And any organization that has not paid attention to that, leverage that, and see it as an opportunity is ripe for failure. The third thing is you've got to do a heck of a lot more to think about the workforce that you have and the need for education in that new world order. And that goes to leadership teams as well as your employees and the future employees that are sitting in these countries that are looking for opportunities for job employment, growth, and prosperity. And I do think governments and business working together more so on that is going to be really important. And last but not least is to make sure the business community has a set of values that actually go to those stakeholder expectations and a sense of purpose that is well beyond the bottom line. And I think the more business and government can work together, I think the better off we're going to be. And hopefully we can get into some of that dialogue as we sit here in Davos.
Indeed.
At the start of that over the next couple of days.
Bob, it's been a fascinating discussion. I thank you very much for your insights and those of your senior team as well, and for some really thought-provoking questions that have come from the floor and indeed online as well. We're just about out of time. We hope you found the findings of this year's Global CEO Survey of interest. There's much more. So if you want to download the full report, go to our website. That's pwc.com/Davos. Many thanks to the audience who've joined us live here in Davos, having battled through feet of snow even perhaps, and thanks to the viewers who've been watching online. You can still join in the conversation at #CEO Survey. And of course, we hope to see you all again next year for PwC's 22nd Global CEO Survey.
Thank you very much for the hosting of it. Did a great job. Thank you.